Right, I want to start from something that really that Teeter Bhattacharya articulated when she was at the Marxismus Congress in Germany this May, when she basically said that the social reproduction theory is like an idea whose time has come. That's my version. But the way she put it was that the sudden eruption of interest in social reproduction theory is rooted in the particular conjuncture with struggles away from the workplace in the global north. So social reproduction theory is about understanding this. And I think it's very important that we do locate the development of the spreading of social reproduction theory at the moment, not its origins, but its spreading in the particular kinds of movements that we are seeing today. And just in terms of the kind of spreading of social reproduction theory, historical materialism, which some of you may well be familiar with as a Marxist current, launched the re-edition of Lisa Vogel's book back in 2015. Teeter Bhattacharya has edited a collection entitled Social Reproduction Theory, and this was launched at Historical Materialism in 2017. There was a long article about, I'm going to call it SRT because everybody does call it SRT and it just makes it easier. There's a long article in Jacobin in January. And then Teeter Bhattacharya herself spoke at Marxismus, and she's going to be speaking again in London in November at RS 21. Have got an event in November. And the central thing is, and it really is a huge step forward, is about understanding oppression and the link between oppression and class. Now I want to make clear from the outset that Marx himself uses the term social reproduction, particularly in Volume 2 of Capital, but the understanding of social reproduction which is developed amongst Marxist feminists is not the same term, and I'll come on to that in a minute, although the way it is being developed, it partly also encompasses Marx's notion of social reproduction. It's mainly used to explain women's oppression. That was its starting point. It has moved on from there. It has become much broader, and one writer warns of the danger that it can be used as a fancy word for housework. It is a concept which actually has kind of multiple interpretations. And one of the dangers currently that I'm going to come on to is that it can become a label for explaining all kinds of social movements, whether they are street movements, strike movements, and so forth. But our starting point has to be that after years and years, if you go back to the 1980s with the development of post-structuralism, of postmodernism, of identity politics, followed on, with privilege theory and intersectionality, that this represents a huge step forward because it is about reading Marx, about reading Capital, and trying to understand women's oppression in particular, but other oppressions, starting from a Marxist analysis. So I'm actually going to look at two people in particular. I'm going to look at Lisa Vogel's Marxism and the Oppression of Women, and Teeter Bhattacharya's essay in this, How Not to Skip Class, the Social Reproduction of Labour and the Global Working Class. Now, Lisa Vogel essentially is trying to locate women's oppression within the categories of capital, and Teeter Bhattacharya is conceptualizing the reproduction of labour power within the circulation of capital by developing an addition to the circulation of capital. Now, if that sounds a bit like double Dutch, and it may well do, hopefully it does, if it does, and hopefully it will become clear in the process of me explaining what the idea is about. But interestingly, if you read Lisa Vogel's foreword in Teeter Bhattacharya's collection, she says, and this I think is very important, in the long run, however, I think we must jettison two dearly held assumptions. First, the assumption that the various dimensions of difference, for example, race, class and gender, are comparable. Second, the implication that the various categories are equal in causal weight. Now, she doesn't spell it out in that, but what she is indicating that one of those elements, and this is what she argues in her book, class, is actually more important in terms of shaping things than the other elements. She goes on to argue that SRT has to see how all the different categories fit together. Bhattacharya then states that the fundamental insight of SRT is simply put that human labour is at the heart of creating or reproducing society as a whole. Now, the origins of social reproduction theory actually go back to debates and discussions in the 1970s and the early 1980s, when Marxists and feminists were grappling with how to explain women's oppression. And at the time, people were trying to deal with the fact that Marx and Engels had not talked about the working class family because they thought the working class family wouldn't really come into existence. They talked about it disappearing. And so by default, people wanted to explain about women's oppression under capitalism and the role of the family and how that fitted with the accumulation of capital. It was part and parcel of trying to explain the totality of women's lives, how women's oppression was shaped women's role in work, how it led to unequal pay and discrimination over jobs, how to explain women's sexuality, domestic violence, rape, and so on and so forth. And the basic ideas which came out of that debate at the time, as many of you, or some of you will remember, was the theory that actually there were two spheres. It's known as the dual systems theory, that on the one hand you have capitalism, which can explain exploitation and what happens to women at work, but then you have patriarchy, a system of male power, which explains all the rest of discrimination against women, the fact that women do the bulk of the work in the home and are discriminated against and face violence and so on and so forth. And that became known as dual systems theory. At the same time, there were people who were working on a unitary theory of women's oppression in opposition to dual systems, and a whole number of Marxists converged on a very similar analysis of women's oppression, locating it in the reproduction of labour power for capital, not for men but for capital, and actually that it was usually privatised in the family. In other words, labour power can actually be reproduced by workers having to live in all sorts of, if you think of under apartheid, of black workers actually having to live in camps near work, but the rest of their families actually living back in what were Bantu lands at the time. Or you think of when residential quarters are set up for workers, and that still happens in places like Bangladesh and China and so forth, and that's actually where they reproduce themselves on a daily basis. But the overwhelming majority of the reproduction of the working class on a day-to-day basis and on a generational basis is privatised, is within the family. So a whole number of it's quite interesting. If you read the Jacobin article from January, they start off their article with a list of about 20 to 30 different Marxists who actually roughly came up with the same sorts of conclusions. I'm just going to name a number of them: Joanna Brenner, Maria Ramas, Martha Jimenez, Chris Harman, Lindsay German. And Lisa Vogel was one of these Marxists who developed her ideas in the same period. And essentially, her key contribution in this discussion was that really capital requires the reproduction of labour power. It's an obvious thing to state, but actually unless we are living and carry on living and reproducing, then capitalism would collapse, because actually the source of surplus value is the fact that we go to work, and there are continually people who will go to work for the exploitation process. But then she goes on to argue that women and men are stand in an unequal relationship to capital because of women's reproductive capacity. That because women need both bear children and breastfeed children, and children need to be brought up, that this means that women are not disposable for capital to be exploited on an equal basis for men. That's one point. And secondly, in the process of pregnancy, child breastfeeding and bringing up children, women actually have to be maintained, have to be looked after. And because of this inequality, therefore, in terms of potential exploitation, this is the root of the inequality of women inside in society. And it explains, on the one hand, why women are treated unequally at work, why they get unequal pay, they get different kinds of jobs, and face all sorts of kinds of discriminations in that way, but also why capital faces a contradiction, is the way she puts it, between wanting to have women in the workforce to exploit them and therefore generate more surplus value, on the other hand needing women in the home in order to do the reproductive work in the home. And therefore capital is in a contradictory position, but also so are women in this contradictory position between the extent to which women can be exploited by going out to work and the extent to which they actually have to stay at home and so forth. And therefore the key point for her is actually the reproductive capacity, the biological reproductive capacity and impact that has on women. Now, at one level, people like Brenner and Ramas and Chris Harman actually come to the same understanding with slight differences which are important. But there is a very big overlap in terms of that understanding of the way the capitalist family works how the working class family works under capitalism and the impact that it has in terms of understanding the roots of women's oppression. Just a couple of asides. Vogel actually generalises this particular analysis to all of class society. She takes the bulk of it, which is actually about only 16 pages in her book, at the end of the book, from an economist called Paddy Quick, who is a Maoist. And really, I think one of the things about Vogel's analysis is it operates at a highly abstract level, which is a reflection of her Althusserian approach to theory. So before I go on to raise what I think are important criticisms, I want to stress that nevertheless, at the centre of her analysis is something which is similar to what is in Harman and Brenner and so forth, which is that the oppression of women is rooted in the relationship of reproduction of the working class to capital, and she actually argues in the book is driven by the needs of capital and capital accumulation. So on that point, she is absolutely clear. Now, one of the problems is, in terms of this discussion, that I have discovered is that some Marxists only read that chapter at the end of the book, which is a bit cheeky really, because she did write over 200 pages and only to focus on 16 pages skews your perspective in terms of the totality of what she is trying to say. And I say that just in case there is anybody in this room. If you haven't read the rest of the other 200, then I think really it's probably quite important that you do. And one of the reasons for it, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that she spends a long time demolishing Engels and his key essay, The Rise of Class, the Family, I always get this wrong, The Rise of Property, Private Property. Thank you, I always get this, thank you. Well, you know the one I'm referring to. Now, a number of things that she says about the article, about Engels, are absolutely true. He did write it in a rush because he wanted to get it out in response to Bebel. The evidence that he relied on then was contemporary from his point of view. He was up to date. But actually, there's loads of anthropological work which has been done since, which is very important. But the key thing about a problem with Vogel's approach to Engels is that she does not understand the centrality, and she says it in her book. She says at one point, he spends so much time talking about the rise of class and the state that he really wasn't focusing on the question of women's oppression. And you think, duh. Actually, understanding that women's oppression only rose because of changes in the forces of production which led to changes in the way we live our lives, which we get our lives, get nourishment and so forth, which led to the creation of surplus, led to divisions developing inside society, which put pressure on the old lineage structures which maintained the egalitarian relationships, that then broke through those lineages, broke those relationships, and the need to control the surplus, to pass on the means of production, meant the controlling of women's reproductive capacity, and therefore the control of women's sexuality, therefore the development of the family, and the state in order to maintain a minority class rule. That those things all go together. They might not have been spelled out quite as neatly as I have done now in Engels, but actually most people reading Engels actually do get that out of him, and certainly a whole number of anthropologists have done, as well as other Marxists. And actually, Chris Harman wrote an extremely good updating of Engels from that point of view, which is still worth reading. But one of the points I want to draw out is what is clear from her discussion about that is that Vogel does not start from changes in the force of production and the pressure that puts on relations of production as being the key motor in terms of the development of society. And and this becomes important in terms of a method of approach. But it also means that we are bereft of any analysis of where the origins of, well, are there any origins to women's oppression? Were women always oppressed or weren't they? And I think therefore the Engels we actually have to rescue in the way that I have described. Now, because she underrates, she's dismissive of the question of technology when she's talking about Morgan, who provided the anthropological underpinnings of Engels' work. It means, and this is because she's an Althusserian, because she doesn't start from the changes in the forces of production and so on and so forth, I think she is unable to explain, or anybody who follows through this kind of methodology is not equipped to be able to understand how society changes and how women's oppression and other things actually change along with it. I think that is one of the weaknesses in the method. Now, I have a couple of other problems. Other people may not have the same problem with them, but I think that her description of women's role in reproductive role in terms of pregnancy and childbearing and so forth is really based on what happens under capitalist society. I did a lot of quite really fascinating reading done by an obstetrician in North America who realized that actually women's experience of pregnancy and childbearing and their role in the tribes where he was working in was completely different from his experience in American society. And he started collecting data from all over the world, and actually the conclusions he came to were that hunter-gatherer societies, pregnancy and breastfeeding and so forth of women makes absolutely no difference at all to the participation of their in terms of social life. It's fascinating stuff. And I mean, he just gives loads and loads of examples. You know, he talks about a group that go off hunting on horseback, and suddenly he realised that a woman had stopped going, and she got off her horse, she had the baby, she cleaned it all up and dealt with it all and wrapped it up in a blanket, jumped back on the horse, and she's back joining the group again before anybody realised she'd stopped. And he just, because, and he actually has arguments about why this is the case, because the physical way of life of those women, therefore pregnancy was shaped differently, and therefore the interaction between way of life and pregnancy was different. Now, I mean, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I do actually think that question of how we change our nature socially, nature is social, and we can't just reduce it biologically in the way that I think is a problem in Vogel. Right, but the key thing, the other weakness is that towards the end of the book, Vogel actually talked about the central question of equality in terms of struggle and the need to fight for equality, and I think that's absolutely right. We should support every single fight against injustice, for equality, and so on and so forth. But that leads her to the conclusion that because women can be unequal right across the classes in capitalism, therefore you should build a cross-class movement. And therefore, where she starts out with a theory which is about the centrality of class shaping women's oppression and the need to fight against capitalism, she ends the book with essentially a two struggles position. And that therefore means that she's got a different political conclusion from where her basic method started from. Now, what people do with people's theories, as we know from all the different strands of Marxism, is not their fault. So I'm now going to go on to talk about Teeter Bhattacharya, based on some of the conferences that I've been to and I've listened to her speak, and mainly this essay here, because interestingly in this book, whereas up until now Lisa Vogel has been taken as the foundational theory for social reproduction theory, although, as I say, a whole number of other people use the term social reproduction theory well beyond Lisa Vogel and historical materialism. What is interesting about Teeter Bhattacharya's essay in her collection is that she starts from a different point. Now, she starts from, and I'm going to quote this because it is, again, very important that I think we see, that we understand that there's a difference between what Teeter's aspirations are in terms of what she thinks she's doing and what she actually ends up doing. So I'll read out what she says in the essay is the purpose of social reproduction theory. She says, her purpose is not just that class is important, but the working class is a revolutionary subject. So she aims to go for a theoretical restatement of the working class as a revolutionary subject. And this is gobsmacking, isn't it? If you think about, the whole discussion about intersectionality and privilege theory and so forth, for somebody to say, what I really want to do is to put the working class as a subject of history back at the centre of the theory of oppression, is a massive shift from where we have been, and therefore is very, very important. She then goes on to say, she's aiming for a broader understanding of the working class than those employed as wage labourers at any given moment. Well, at one level, I don't think any of us would have any problem with that, because it's simply because you like me and you no longer work, because I'm an OAP, old age pensioner, or children in working class families, or somebody who happens to be unemployed. You would never say that they weren't part of the working class simply because they didn't happen to be working at any given point in time. So at that level, I don't have a problem I don't necessarily have a problem with what she's saying there. But then the next point is a reconsideration of class struggle to signify more than the struggle over wages and working conditions. Well, I don't really have a problem with that either, because as a Marxist, I've never thought that the struggle to change society was simply about wages and conditions. It has always been about any issue, whether it is triggered in terms of people's workplaces, whether it is triggered as an issue inside society. So I don't have, on the face of it, I don't have a problem with any of that at all. So the question is, well, is there a problem? Maybe there isn't one. Well, I do actually think that there is, and I want to try to explain where I think it lies So what I'm fundamentally going to propose is that there are two dangers. One is a danger in what she then goes on to develop, is from arguing about the importance of social movements as a tactical response to current circumstances, to an adaptation to the idea that social movements outside the workplace have equal weight with class struggle at the point of production. I think that is the central danger in what she goes on to develop. It needn't necessarily be the case, but I think that's a direction that she and other people who follow this particular line of argument, that is their direction of travel. And that goes back to what I said at the outset, that she herself sees it as a theorization, really, of what is happening today, that social movements predominate over class struggles triggered at the point of production. Now, she herself bases herself on a Canadian Marxist called Michael Leibovitz, who's written a book called Beyond Capital. And I don't have the time to do justice to his book because it's complex, it's fascinating, but he wrote, essentially he says this, these are the key things that she takes up in her essay. The first thing that she says is that Marx intended to write 6 books and not just the 3 volumes of Capital and the theories of surplus value. There's an argument about that, because he actually says in the second preface of volume 1 of Capital, he mentions a couple of other volumes he was going to write, but he doesn't, a book on wages isn't one of them. But Leibovitz says he always intended to write one on wages, he didn't write it, so he's going to write it. Well, good luck to you. Sorry, I don't mean it like that, but it's quite, you have to be fairly confident about yourself to be able to say, right, I'm going to write the book that Marx didn't write. Now, the second thing he says is that because he didn't write it, the centrality of wages struggles is missing in volume 1 in particular. And therefore, the presentation of the worker inside Capital is of a passive worker. And therefore, the problem with Capital is that it looks at capitalism from the point of view of capital and not from the point of view of the worker. Now, in all fairness to Marx, he was attempting to uncover the laws of exploitation so that we would all understand the movement of exploitation and the consequences in terms of exploitation being at the heart of the creation of surplus value, and also that crisis was inherent in the system. That's what he wanted to get us to get our heads around, and that therefore there was a fundamental antagonism at the heart of the relationship between labour and capital. But simply because there is a fundamental antagonism, one of the things I want to say in contrast to Leibovitz, in opposition to Leibovitz and also to Teeter Bhattacharya, is simply because there is an antagonism there, which is constant, doesn't necessarily mean to say it is going to break out into struggle or how you can anticipate it is going to break out into struggle. That is another question, that the potential is there for it, yes, but not that you can necessarily say what it is going to be over. So he focuses on the issue of wages, and he develops a concept about needs, that workers' needs are created by capitalist society itself, which is true. Nobody had the need for a smartphone until they started making smartphones and they had to sell them to us. I mean, that argument is absolutely true. But then what he argues, and Teeter Bhattacharya takes over from him, is that workers face capital with their own need for their own self-development. That is the phrase which he uses. In fact, I'll read out the quote that Teeter Bhattacharya uses, because then it makes an absolute central point. The second aspect of the worker, considered as a labour process, is that the activity involved in this process is purposeful activity. In other words, there is a preconceived goal, a goal that exists ideally. before the process itself. And this goal is the worker's conception of self as determined within society. That preconceived goal of production is what Marx described as the worker's own need of development. In other words, he poses, and Teeter Bhattacharya takes that over, that the struggle that workers facing capital in the struggle over wages are putting forward their own needs in face of capital. In other words, you begin to put the worker at the same level of power inside the mode of production as capital. And I think that is fundamentally wrong. That actually capital has power through the ownership of the means of production which workers don't have, and that is the heart of the exploitation process. So I think that Leibovitz gets that wrong, and that is one of the things that Teeter Bhattacharya takes over. She then takes over the fact that in this process of facing capital with their own needs, workers, these needs get struggled over in all sorts of different ways, and not necessarily inside the workplace, because actually if you start from workers' social needs, then you can see that they aren't necessarily needs which will be articulated through the workplace, but they'll be articulated in the community, and nobody's going to argue about them. People need, you know, if you think about the struggles over housing, over water, over air purity, control over land and so on and so forth, these are all needs that workers have. I would actually argue that they are necessary needs. I think that Leibovitz is wrong to call them social needs, and Teeter Bhattacharya is. I think they're necessary needs. You can't live without clean air, and you can't live without water, etc., etc., etc. So I think there's a wrong, but that's another discussion. But that leads, through this, there's an equalisation, there's a shift, a conceptual shift which goes on, which locates now the struggle of workers over social needs outside the workplace as being on the same plane as struggles at the point of production. Now, this brings me to the final point that I'm going to have time to make, which is about the question of social movements, because I don't think anybody in this room is going to have an issue with any of the social movements which are mentioned either by Leibovitz or Teeter Bhattacharya or anybody else, that those are absolutely important social movements. This is not an issue of what people are fighting over, but it's an issue of power. And again, this is complicated, because some social movements can win without workers taking industrial action. We've just seen in Ireland, it has been perfectly possible to win a change in the constitution without any level of strike action at all. I don't think there was any. But what's interesting is Ireland has won over the change in the constitution. We have been able to defend abortion legislation in this country without strike action. But will Ireland get the provision of abortion clinics and contraception and so forth free for working class, for people inside Irish society as easily? The answer is no, because capital, in a neoliberal phase cutting back on everything, will be much more reluctant to provision it than they are to concede it in terms of, they can concede it easily at the level of the law, but provisioning it is going to be a tougher question. I'd take another issue. Let's take the question of war. The Stop the War movement in this country put between 1 and 2 million people on the streets, and we were not able to stop that war from taking place. If you think about Egypt and Tunisia, where you had the revolutions in 2010, 2011, the Egyptian working class were able to topple Mubarak, and the Tunisian workers were able to topple Ben Ali. It wasn't just the occupations in the squares that did it, or the demonstrations in the streets that did it. It was the fact that workers, centrally organised as workers, thrust their power as workers behind those movements that made the difference. And again, if you think of the Russian Revolution, the Russian Revolution was able to stop the war because workers actually succeeded in taking power. So the central question really, I've got to finish, is I want to quote from the last essay in the book, which is Cynthia Arutza, who is writing about the women's strike in 2017 and why it was called a women's strike. Adopting the term strike was meant to emphasise the work that women perform, not only in the workplace but outside it, in the sphere of social reproduction. It also had an additional function which can be better understood by taking into consideration the US labour situation. And that really, in a way, sums it up, that there is a blurring here going on. And I thought the women's strike was fantastic, and I think, the women's marches have been fantastic. They've been fantastic inspiration, and the way in which there was movement on the streets and action across the world on March the 8th, 2017 was absolutely brilliant. And we need to take a leaf out of the book of everybody doing that in this country, and actually try to get much more movement on International Women's Day than we have done so far. But final point I'm going to end on is something that Teeter Bhattacharya herself said. I don't know whether anybody else who was at Marxism recalled it. She actually said in Marxism, in Marx's writings, that oppression divides and class divides, and that in Marx there is no clear argument that class is more important than oppression. So I thought I'd read out what he writes in the General Rules. I thank Volkart for this. General Rules to the International Working Men's Association in October 1864. He says that the economical subjection of the man of labour to the monopoliser of the means of labour, that is, the source of life. In other words, people are now saying that really people haven't taken account of social reproduction. He's wrong. Marx was talking about, when he's analysing capital, he's talking about how we live our lives, how we get our livelihoods. Anyway, the source of life lies at the bottom of servitude in all its forms, of all social misery, mental degradation and political dependence. So he does create what people would call a hierarchy between exploitation and oppression, and therefore the third rule, interestingly enough, and I'll finish on this one, the third rule is, therefore, God, where did I write it? Oh yeah, here. That the economic emancipation of the working classes is therefore the great end to which every political movement ought to be subordinate as a means. The economic emancipation of the working classes. So that was what the centre of the First International was about. Workers have to emancipate themselves, and that goes back to the other thing that he and Engels said, is the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, or as Rosa Luxemburg put it, where the chains are forged, there must they be broken. And the final point is, my concern is that SRT, the way it's being developed, is moving in an ambiguous direction towards accommodating to the street movements and the social movements, and not understanding that much as we are involved in those, we always have to point back to the centrality of the point of production and get people to understand that we need to raise the level of workers' struggles there in order to be able to bring down capitalism.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Sheila, because I've been interested in stuff about social reproduction theory, but rather confused, not quite sure where it fitted in. And I think you've made that a lot clearer today. From what I understand, I think there are insights and ideas within it that we would welcome and want to engage with. At the same time, talking to the people who are putting those ideas forward, we would want to bring them back very firmly to the mothership, to Engels, to say, are you actually going to ignore the fact that Engels talked about the world historic defeat of the female sex, that the rise of class society was the world historic defeat of the female sex. Are you ignoring that? That you have to remember that Engels based a lot of his writing, in particular in The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, on Marx's notebooks, so that while Marx may not spell these things out, you know, the quotes that Sheila read out don't say women, 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 but they talk about oppression, they talk about exploitation, and Marx talks about the fact that we can't begin to struggle and do things until we look at mankind's basic needs, at the basic need, and I can't quote word for word, I'm afraid, but for food, for shelter, for all those things. And this is in a way in conflict with what Sheila was describing about the social reproduction theory. So I think we need to look at it with interest, engage with the people who are putting those ideas forward and say, yes, but what about? Yes, but what about? Can we integrate your ideas with what we are saying? Can we bring you back to Engels, bring you back to Marx?
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, what Sheila described as the sort of description, the vision of working class as a sort of more and more blurred category, and also the idea of almost any act of resistance becomes on equal level as maybe a mass strike, reminds me very much of some of the Italian autonomists and Tony Negri. I don't know if Silvia Federici might be a sort of a bridge between those things. Second point, I live in the Spanish state. The 8th of March was absolutely brilliant. I mean, it was enormous, a real mass strike. The unions, including the big unions, actually called a strike. I mean, some people complained they've only called a 2-hour strike. I think nowhere else in the world did the mainstream trade unions call a strike for the 8th of March. So it's a massive success. But it also showed up a certain contradiction and indefinition in the call for a strike. Because on the one hand, it's a sort of symbolic thing to show that when women don't act, then, you know, they show the absence. But then they did call a strike. In fact, the women's movement in Catalonia was brilliant. They went and spoke to the main trade unions and said, we want you to call a strike. And they managed to get them to do it. And so then there was complaints about all these men going on strike. It's sort of somehow taking away the lead from the women and covering up the women's strike. And so in a real, if you call a strike, then it's a strike and you want everybody out. If you want a sort of symbolic type of action to show what happens when only the women are missing, then you're not really calling a strike. So I think it was a massive success that it was a strike, but again, it shows up certain confusions in that. And finally, coming back to what Sarah was just saying, I think from what people have described here, there's all sorts of interesting things you can learn. Like from Silvia Federici, you can learn about the massive witch hunts over hundreds of years. But then to simply accept and import whole blocks of theory into our vision of the world, I think there's a danger of ending up with sort of Frankenstein's monster with a leg from here, an arm from here, and the thing falls apart. So I think we can learn things and take up issues from these new theories, but not simply import them wholesale. That's dangerous.
It's interesting. I wanted to just come to Federici as well, because what she is... I start in a different way. Sorry for my English. What struck me, I have been dealing with the question of abortion through history since quite a while now, and birth control, and how was the debate in the ruling class, what have the reasons been, and so on. And what struck me in SRT is this sort of mechanical approach to the question of birth. Women have to be controlled to produce the children for the society, for capitalism, and so on. And Federici argues that capitalism needed to take control over the women to have children for the development of capitalism. And if you look at the history, if you look at science, the historians, it's completely refuted. It's completely refuted that it has been basically wise women because it was only a minority of wise women who knew how to abort, who knew about contraception, etc. A tiny minority. And so this is, it struck me, why is it still perpetuated as state-of-the-art theory? The other thing is, if I look to Germany at the end of the 19th century, there was some panic about lower birth figures, and there was a huge debate in 1913 about these lower figures, and the laws should be enforced that women don't abort, and so on and so on. At the same time, the German population in the space of 40 years had grown from about 40 million to 65 million. So there was an increase in population. Although there was the births were falling, there was an increase in population. And the main concern of the ruling class was the sexual freedom people experienced, the question of foreign workers and their children they didn't really want. There was a campaign against the Polish workers because they were too political, because they were striving for an independent state. So these terms in which the debate was framed, and in the end it was the question of taking control over or reinforcing the family, taking control over our lives, which was basically sorry, I don't know the English now, where the main thing was taking control of the body of the woman.
I think Sheila's right to start with what we have in common with people who are writing around the question of social reproduction theory. But I also think it's important that we do distinguish between the way in which the most current writings, while starting from, they're quite often critical of things like intersectionality and so on, although they're less critical of privilege theory, which I think is quite interesting, and I think is connected to their rejection of Engels, actually. But what I do think we have to locate is that starting from good aims, ends up really being an adaptation to the low level of working class struggle. That is, which I think runs through it a lot. For example, Bhattacharya writes, where a struggle for a higher wage is not possible, different kinds of struggles, basically around social reproduction, may also erupt. And she talks about how neoliberalism has weakened unions at the same time as producing rising social movements. Now the problem is it's not either or. It's not either you have working class struggle or you have social movements. Not only is it not either or, but actually unless the social movements connect with a rising tide of class struggle, the reality is they go down, and we've seen this time and time again over the last 30, 40 years. We saw it around Seattle and the anti-globalization struggles where everybody thought, oh look, we're on the streets, we're occupying, we're taking on the system and so on. Didn't connect with a rising tide of working class struggle. We saw it here in 2011 when we had the student riots, and then we had the big public sector strike, and people thought, you know, this is going to go somewhere. Actually the trade union leaders allowed it to fizzle out, and therefore the movement goes down. So that idea of saying that where does the real power lie? How do we actually win? Yes, we support all of these struggles. Of course we do. We're on Grenfell and so on and so forth. It's really, really important. But where does the power lie to make sure that we win these struggles? You have to look at the organised working class. And here, I think there is an attempt to kind of fudge over what that actually is and what we actually mean by it. So, you know, she says we should reconsider our conceptual vision of the working class, and then she talks about how we need an integrative vision of the Latinx hotel worker, the flexi-time working mother, the African American school teacher, and so on and so forth. And she does this in a section where she says not everybody is involved in waged work, and then she talks about these people as if these people are outside waged work. I'm sorry, they're not. A Latinx hotel worker is in waged work. An African American school teacher is in waged work. These people are in waged work, and what we have to do, I think, is to say that the vision, in a way, it implies, doesn't it, that because what she says is we can't use the data that Marx Marx used. We can't look at class in the way that Marx did. We need a more integrative vision. The implication is that what Marx meant by class are white men going down factories, when the reality is, of course, you talk about class, you talk about immigrant workers, women workers, etc., etc., etc. In other words, that vision of an emancipatory rising movement exists within the waged, organised working class. And it is when that class starts to fight at the point of production that we can then talk about linking up with social movements and actually getting somewhere and changing society, fudging the question and saying there's a low level of class struggle, therefore let's look over here and call that class struggle, I think is actually unhelpful despite its well-meaning aims. Oh.
Yeah, it seems to me there's a sort of untethering human reproduction from class society, from class-divided society. And I see it, I've read Lise Vogel's work. It wasn't that easy to understand all of it, but I read it. I've read little bits of what Teeter Bhattacharya said. But it seems, certainly with Vogel, there's a flattening of alienation of the family. So having children becomes reducing it to its economic role only. So in other words, you need to produce the next generation of people in order to labour, in order for society to function. You would need that under socialism, but it's a bit more than that, isn't it? Because class society shapes how individuals are brought up. And the rise of class society is very important because it was about privatising. Hunter-gatherer society was about the whole community raising children. Childcare being a communal thing, not just what those who could give birth, usually women were the ones who were doing it, not just them doing it, but the whole community doing it. So there wasn't sexism, and there wasn't a thing called enforced monogamy on women. There was it was only when private property began to develop, and the idea that children are brought up in, whether it's extended family, but still private structures, not as a whole community doing it, you start to have a very different way of kind of looking at things. And it doesn't just become about bringing up kids. It becomes the idea that women ought to be monogamous. And they ought to do this. So it becomes an ideological thing with the family. It isn't just that they're brought up raising these workers or raising these peasants or raising slaves or whoever. It becomes about the idea women ought to go and do that. So I'm fast forwarding now to capitalism. But the family isn't just about bringing up children, it's about the idea that ideologically, women ought to spend more time looking after kids. They ought to do that. They ought to be heterosexual, because we will legalise being, decriminalise being gay, but really, you ought to be straight because it's somehow better. You ought to not be trans, it's somehow better. You can be a single mother, we're not going to bang you in an asylum, but really we think you ought to get married instead. So the family is about ideologically putting forward a kind of view that a certain way of living that isn't just about raising kids cheaply, but the superstructure, isn't it? The idea that women's oppression is an ideological thing. The family plays an ideological role, and not just bringing up children cheaply, because I don't have kids. I'm 45 years old, but I'm still oppressed by sexism. It doesn't matter that I've got no kids. It becomes further than just whether you can literally give birth or not. It becomes an ideological justification, and the family does that, and I just feel there's a kind of flattening with the way that Vogel talks, and Teeter Bhattacharya does the same thing, and it kind of, raising children becomes just like a factory, rather than actually like I can't articulate it properly, but it becomes like a factory, just a family raising human beings is like, we're going to work, paid work, but it's not the same. It's the family has to fit round the economic system. It's not the other way around. It's shaped. Okay, it's the economic system that shapes the family, not the other way around.
Yes, I think this last sentence was very important, and it's, I think, central to understand the debate on Lisa Vogel and the question of oppression and exploitation. What Marx actually says, and Sheila cited the sentences, is that the roots of oppression lie in exploitation, that class is first, and out of the class oppression comes the women's oppression, and which means that, of course, the biology of women in childbearing and getting children is, of course, central to understand their role in society now. This is a starting point, but this has been also the case before there was women's exploitation. Even in societies where there was no class, and we understand it that there was no women's oppression because both were equally important in providing subsistence means of resources for the family. So this means that there must have been changed something in society, which then suddenly made the biological role of women become a focus for their oppression. And what was it? I think it was the development of new productive forces, as Sheila said, which made the difference, meaning new forms of agriculture, agricultural production, which led to that women led to a process where women were not central anymore to the productive process. So I think, therefore, the centrality of exploitation is important to understand that it was not the changes in the reproductive sphere, but the other way around, on the changes in production which led to changes in the reproduction. So this is one thing. The second is, this does not mean that the fight against oppression is less important than the fight against exploitation, which has some stupid Maoists, I would say, have in the early 80s, I remember, have said things like this: there is a main contradiction and there are secondary contradiction, and oppression is only secondary oppression, therefore it's not so important. But not many said it, not so many as the feminists actually implied that. They said even the Maoists in Germany were they had read Engels and his writings. But there was this tendency to neglect forms of oppression also in the reproductive process. So this is very an important contribution. And of course, Me Too movement, things like this are very important, and we support it completely. And it's not doesn't mean that the fight against oppression is less important. The last sentence last word I want to say is that Engels' solution was that capitalism, that only by drawing in the women into the productive process, again, as it was in the early times, then oppression can be overcome. It's by their becoming equal in the process of production. That's the solution.
This is the final contribution. I'm really sorry I couldn't fit everyone in, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks to Sheila, because I think it's really useful to try and unpick and understand, the different ways that people are using the theory. And I mean, I don't think it's not a surprise really that we're having to defend Marxism when we talk about women's liberation, because we have to defend Marxism in every arena, particularly in a time where you can't point in very many parts of the world to mass workers' struggle, and you certainly can't point to successful workers' revolution. So we have a job to do to hang on to the ideas, and I do think Engels' ideas in terms of understanding the roots of women's oppression, they need to be updated, but they are really important. And in terms of what Julie was saying about the family, actually, talking about the contradictions of the family as the haven in a heartless world, at the same time as being the place where capitalism gets its workers fit and fed for work, and therefore it's the root of women's oppression, but also why none of us actually live in the kind of ideal family that they would like us to be living in, but why there is that pressure to do that. But I think we also have to hold on to what you can do about it and why we hold the working class central. And actually the Russian Revolution is very important to us to say, you know, when workers use their power, they start arranging the world in a different place. And the kind of things that happened in the Russian Revolution in terms of collective childcare and communal kitchens, all of that is something that we have to constantly, I think, you know, bring back into mainstream, because it's so hidden from history, and the way that obviously it was turned into Stalinism, and as Trotsky talked about the family being rehabilitated with the ruble. But in terms of how we relate to the movements today, I mean, I think, you know, we have to look at how political and economic struggles feed into each other. Rosa Luxemburg talked about it, but we are not economists. We are the tribunes of the oppressed. And actually, I think the Me Too movement is a challenge for us. It's a challenge for us to say, this is fantastic, but how are we then taking it and building it deeper in our workplaces, in our, you know, we need to be part of it in order to shape it, to be honest, and prove that those things, not just in theory, but in practice, are possible.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for the brilliant discussion. Okay, so we'll bring Sheila back to sum up. Thanks.
Got to. It's all right, I just swapped them around. Right, thanks to everybody for all the contributions. I'm just going to say a couple of things. I'm actually going to try to explain something that I didn't have time to explain for, which is, I think, very important as part of this debate, because I think, I want to restate, I think we actually have to see ourselves as involved in a discussion with people who are moving towards an understanding that class is central in terms of understanding oppression, and we want to engage with people who are doing that and try to win them then to a full understanding of what I would call historical materialism and the central role of workers' struggles in terms and the whole revolutionary process. And precisely because, as a couple of people have said, that the level of actual struggle at the moment, you know, if we had a May 68, you know, if we had a general strike, or there was another outbreak like there was in Egypt, that makes the case for you. And I am of that generation, and you couldn't argue that the power of workers wasn't central when, you know, you saw what was happening in France. And therefore, when that isn't happening, it means the patiently explaining is very, very important in terms of winning people who have come to the conclusion, as you said it this morning in her talk, that really since the crash, people have seen the devastating impact, you know, the banking crash, that people are then wanting to understand the way capitalism works, and therefore that is leading people on a trajectory, and we actually have to move them on. And secondly, ironically, given that this is allegedly a theory which is supposed to be about breaking with economism and putting a multiracial, women, trans, gay, lesbian, male, working class at the centre of everything, in fact, and some people have made this criticism, Joanna Brenner makes if you read her review of Vogel's book way back in the day in 1983 when the book was originally written, she says the problem with this is it's actually reductionist. It hasn't got the richness of understanding of women's oppression that had emerged in the course of the 70s and 80s when a whole series of writers were beginning to apply them to the understanding of the way the family worked, the consequences in terms of the oppressions of mechanisms, sex discrimination, violence, rape, all those sorts of questions which emerged in terms of and taken forward. And actually the best chapter in Cliff's book, Haven in a Heartless World, about the struggle for women's liberation, he draws enormously on that rich analysis which came out of that out of that period in terms of understanding oppression. And actually, I think it was Julie who talked about flattening. That is absurd. I think that there is an element of flattening, ironically, economic reductionism going on, because, anyway, secondly, the thing that I did want to talk about is the social reproduction theory is now being used to explain all kinds of oppression, and all struggles against all forms of oppression are being explained in terms of social reproduction theory. There's just, I mean, and I find that gobsmacking, because if you want to explain the oppression against people who are disabled, or if you want to explain trans, or if you want transphobia, if you want to explain homophobia, actually, I don't think it will do simply to say, well, read Lisa Vogel. It won't do. That's not what she was doing. You actually have to go and read other analyses which actually build on the question of the family. There's Sue's article about transphobia. Laura is bringing out a book on trans, and so on and so forth. We actually have much richer explanations of all of this, which have been written. But the thing that I do think it is, that I do want to talk about, and that is this, is the way in which the application of social reproduction theory to divisions inside the working class when it comes to the question of racism are also going, I think, in the wrong direction. Because the way it is posed is this, that workers turn up to the workplace already racialized and genderized. In other words, the woman already turns up oppressed, and the black worker or Asian worker or whatever turns up to the workplace already suffering from racism. Furthermore, they'll be living in worse conditions, they'll be getting lower wages, they'll be facing discrimination, and. That is all absolutely true. That is the consequences of oppression. However, the key question is, who is responsible for the fact that black and Asian workers, by and large, live in worse conditions, have worse schooling, are poorer, get and women, black and Asian women workers get the lowest paid jobs and the most precarious jobs? Who is responsible for that? And it is not other workers. Now, the racism, and it is absolutely true that if you read the history of the American working class, the legacy of slavery and racism inside the American working class had devastating consequences in terms of polarizing white workers against black workers. And I'll come back to that in a second. But actually, it is quite deliberate strategies of the ruling class to develop racist explanations for what they want to do in the drive to accumulate, whether it was over slavery, whether it is over immigration. And Phil Marfleet has a wonderful article in this month's Socialist Review which goes through the policy of migration towards the United States and the use of immigration law, the way in which capital actually wants the workers on the one hand, but needs the discrimination and racism against on the other, and the powerful mix that then creates for dividing workers one from another. But that is not our fault, and it is very clear that we actually have to say that racism is driven from above by the needs of capital, and the solution to it lies in the combining of workers and the high points of struggle, whether it's through mass unionization struggles in this country, whether it is in mass unionization struggles in the United States. Wherever there is high points of generalized struggle, the young Irish workers who led the struggle in 1888, known as, the Match Women's Strike, they were very young teenage girls who led that struggle and then had a huge impact in terms of the Docker struggles, which led to the mass unionism and led to the most oppressed can rise up and actually lead the struggle and generalize the struggle, and out of that is born the unity and the rejection of the divisions and the racism and so forth. So we don't start from the fact that simply because we suffer from these divisions, therefore in our heads we are going to accept them. And there are two things that are going for us, and that is why Marx and Engels were involved in building the International Working Men's Association. And this is what I want to end in, is capitalism does divide. We know that. But the potential for unity comes from the potential from struggle because of the way in which we are under attack. Now that struggle may happen inside the workplace or outside the workplace. Our responsibility as revolutionaries is to do the second thing. We actually have to understand how to take that struggle forward, how to develop it, the ideas which are needed in terms of winning. And one of the central ideas that we actually have to win is in fact the power that our class still has to change society. That power has not gone away. And particularly because these theories are coming out of the academy in the United States in particular, read Kim Moody's book. He talks about the reconfiguration of capital in the United States, and what does that involve? Companies like Amazon, huge transport hubs of rail workers, of lorry drivers, of people running airlines, and people in huge warehouses who are assembling goods as well as actually distributing works. They have absolutely massive power. They are not unionized. They are not collectively organized. And one of the things that we actually have to be also arguing for is these people need to be organised, because this is what is called the messy, racialised, sexually working class. It is. They are black and white and male and female. They're at the heart of American capitalism. They have huge power to bring the bloody lot down. And therefore, revolutionary socialists, why we do at the same time as campaigning over what Trump is doing over the migrant workers, serious revolutionaries would actually have to be saying, what are we doing to organise that power? Because they are the workers, the young workers, who can actually bring the whole bloody edifice down. And that was what the International Working Men's Association was about, and that is the tradition that we are trying to build in, the Socialist Workers Party. Why I'm still in it all these years, and why I want everybody to be in it, so we can actually pull the whole bloody edifice down and create a different kind of society.